The fluorescent lights hummed above the stage at the University of Minnesota's Northrop Auditorium. 2,000 seats packed with bodies that generated heat and tension in equal measure. Half the crowd wore red MAGA hats. The other half clutched handmade signs reading, "Defend Ilhan" and "Stop Islamophobia." Between them sat journalists from every major network, cameras positioned at strategic angles to capture whatever explosion was about to detonate. Ilhan Omar sat at her podium on stage left, her hijab perfectly arranged, her hands clasped in front of her. She'd prepared for this moment for weeks. Her team had compiled binders full of statistics about income inequality, healthcare costs, and student debt. They'd practiced deflection techniques for the inevitable attacks about Israel. They'd rehearsed talking points about being a refugee, a woman of color, a Muslim in America. They thought they were ready. Ben Shapiro stood at his podium on stage right. 5 manila folders sat stacked in front of him, each one labeled in black marker. His expression was flat, clinical, the face of a prosecutor who'd already secured the conviction before the trial began. He'd spent 3 months preparing for this debate, not 3 weeks, 3 months, every public record request, every FEC filing, every voting record, every tweet, every statement, every contradiction, all documented, all verified, all organized into those 5 folders. The moderator stepped to the center podium, a veteran CNN anchor who'd moderated presidential debates. She tapped her microphone twice. "Good evening. Tonight we're here for a discussion between Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and commentator Ben Shapiro on the state of progressive politics in America. We'll begin with opening statements. Each speaker will have 5 minutes, and then we'll move to a structured format where Congresswoman Omar." Shapiro's voice cut through the introduction like a scalpel through skin. "How much money did your campaign pay to your husband's company?" The auditorium went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next speaker. The shocked silence of 2,000 people who just witnessed someone break every rule of debate decorum in the first 10 seconds. The moderator blinked. "Mr. Shapiro, we haven't begun the formal debate. I was explaining the format and it's a simple question." Shapiro didn't look at the moderator. His eyes stayed locked on Omar. "Federal Election Commission reports are public record. Your campaign paid your husband's consulting firm, E Street Group, during your 2020 re-election campaign. How much money? Do you know the number or should I tell you?" Omar's hands unclenched slowly on the podium. She'd expected attacks, but not this. Not immediately. Not before the moderator had finished explaining the rules. Her mouth opened and she managed. "My husband's firm provided legitimate consulting services to my campaign. That's all perfectly legal and properly reported." "That's not what I asked." Shapiro's tone remained flat, devoid of anger or emotion, just clinical precision. "I asked you a number. How much money did you pay to E Street Group during your 2020 campaign? Yes or no? Do you know the exact amount?" The audience leaned forward collectively. This wasn't supposed to be how debates worked. There were supposed to be opening statements, prepared remarks, time limits, moderator-mediated questions. But Shapiro had ignored all of it, and now everyone in the room wanted to hear her answer. Omar's media training kicked in. "I don't have every specific figure memorized, but all of our campaign expenditures are properly reported to the FEC and comply with $2,783,000. Shapiro's words came rapid fire. "Let me put that on the screen for everyone." The overhead projectors lit up. A spreadsheet appeared, taken directly from FEC filings. Yellow highlights marked payments to E Street Group, line after line after line. Small payments at first, then larger ones. Consulting fees, digital strategy, travel expenses, research. Every payment category as vague as possible while still passing FEC requirements. $2,783,000. The number sat at the bottom in bold font. "Before we discuss what your husband allegedly did to earn this money," Shapiro continued, "let's establish the rules for tonight. Can we agree that we're dealing with facts, public records, your own statements, actual votes you've cast, documented evidence, not feelings, not deflections about discrimination, not claims of victimhood, just facts? Can you agree to that standard?" Omar's smile had vanished. The warmth she'd projected for the cameras when she first walked on stage had evaporated. She looked like someone who'd walked into an ambush and was only now realizing how thoroughly trapped she was. "I'm always happy to discuss facts, though I notice you're already framing this conversation in a way that—" "Yes or no?" Shapiro interrupted. "Can we stick to documented evidence tonight? Yes or no?" "Yes, I just said yes." "Good." Shapiro opened the first manila folder without waiting for the moderator's approval or permission. "Then let's continue with the facts about that $2.78 million you paid your husband's company." The moderator made another attempt. "Mr. Shapiro, we really do need to follow the established format. We have a schedule and—" The Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board found that Congresswoman Omar violated state campaign finance law related to these payments. Shapiro continued as if the moderator hadn't spoken. "They ordered her to personally reimburse her campaign committee $3,469 for improper use of campaign funds. That's a matter of public record. Congresswoman, is that correct? Did the board find that you violated campaign finance law?" Omar's lawyer sat in the front row making frantic gestures. This was spiraling. The debate hadn't even officially started and already they were in crisis management mode. But what could they do? Walk off stage? That would look even worse. Refuse to answer? The silence would be damning. "There were some minor accounting discrepancies that were subsequently corrected," Omar said carefully. "The board reviewed the matter and we complied with their recommendations." "The board's order doesn't say accounting discrepancies." Shapiro pulled out a printed document. "It says, and I quote, Omar violated Minnesota Statute 211B-15 by using campaign funds for personal use." Those are the board's words, not mine. Do you dispute the board's findings? "There were issues with how certain expenses were categorized, which we addressed and corrected." "So you violated the law." Shapiro's statement hung in the air. "Third fact, your husband, Tim Minot, currently faces civil lawsuits alleging his cannabis company failed to return over $1 million to South Dakota investors. Is there such a lawsuit? Yes or no?" "My husband's separate business ventures are not. They're relevant when you paid him $2.8 million of donor money, and his track record involves allegedly defrauding other investors. Is there a lawsuit against him? Yes or no?" The crowd was buzzing now, people whispering to each other, journalists typing frantically on laptops, camera operators zooming in on Omar's face, capturing every micro-expression. This wasn't a debate. This was a cross-examination, and the defendant was realizing she had no good answers. "Yes, there's a lawsuit," Omar admitted, "but lawsuits don't prove guilt. Anyone can file a lawsuit for any reason." "Of course not, but they establish a pattern." Shapiro nodded as if conceding a reasonable point. "Fourth fact, another Minot business venture, a winery investment, also faces litigation over mismanaged funds." "Correct. I am not responsible for every business venture my husband has been involved with before or during our marriage. But you are responsible for who you choose to pay nearly $3 million in campaign money to." Shapiro leaned forward slightly. "You made that choice. You decided to hire your husband's firm. You signed off on those payments. You submitted those FEC reports. Yes or no?" 15 seconds of silence. The cameras captured it all. Omar's hands gripping the podium, her jaw clenching, her eyes darting to her lawyer who could only shake his head helplessly. The trap had already closed. Any answer she gave would sound like an admission. "Yes," she finally said, "I hired his firm." "Thank you." Shapiro's tone suggested genuine appreciation for the honest answer, which somehow made it worse. "Now that we've established these facts, here's my question. What exactly did E Street Group do to earn $2.8 million? Name one specific deliverable, one concrete strategy document, one piece of research, one campaign ad they produced, one voter database they built, one thing they created that justified that payment." Omar launched into prepared talking points. E Street Group had provided comprehensive digital strategy for a competitive race. They'd conducted voter outreach in a diverse district. They'd managed complex logistics for campaign events. They'd advised on messaging and media relations. Stop, Shapiro's interruption was surgical. I've reviewed your FEC filings in detail. E Street Group was paid for digital consulting, fundraising consulting, travel expenses, strategic consulting, and research and consulting. Those are the 5 vaguest possible categories allowed by FEC regulations. But here's what I don't see anywhere in those filings. I don't see any actual deliverables. No list of specific services rendered. No itemized breakdown of projects completed. Just categories and dollar amounts. So let me ask again. Can you name one specific thing they produced? I don't have access to every granular detail of campaign expenditures from. You paid them $2.8 million and you can't name one thing they did. Shapiro let that sink in for 3 full seconds. Let me provide some context for everyone. The average household income in Minnesota is $74,000. You paid your husband's company the equivalent of 37 years of average Minnesota family income for a congressional race in a safe Democratic district. The number appeared on screen, 37 years. Barack Obama's entire 2012 presidential campaign paid $40 million total for digital consulting across all firms combined for a national race with 50 states. Shapiro continued. You paid $2.8 million for one congressional district. Does that seem proportionate to you? Our race was competitive. We faced well-funded opponents and you won your Democratic primary by just 2 percentage points against Don Samuels, a local activist with a fraction of your budget. Shapiro interrupted. So either the $2.8 million wasn't well spent, or maybe, just maybe, you were using your campaign as a vehicle to funnel money to your household. Which explanation do you prefer? That's an outrageous accusation. Is it? The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board didn't think so. They found you violated the law, so here's what I think happened. Shapiro's voice accelerated, words tumbling out faster than most people could process. You funneled donor money to your household through your husband's company. You classified those payments in the vaguest possible terms. You couldn't explain what actual services were provided. You got caught. The board found you guilty of violating campaign finance law. You paid a fine. And now you're acting offended that someone has the audacity to ask about it. Omar tried to pivot. This is exactly the kind of targeted harassment that women of color in politics face. The scrutiny applied to me and my colleagues is different from. No, the single word stopped her cold. We're not doing this. I didn't ask about your race. I didn't ask about your gender. I didn't ask about your religion. I asked about $2.8 million in campaign payments to your spouse. If a white male Republican congressman paid his wife $2.8 million in campaign money while she faced multiple fraud lawsuits, what would you call that? Silence. You'd call it corruption. Shapiro answered his own question. You'd demand investigations. You'd call for his resignation. You'd say he was using his office for personal enrichment. But when you do it, suddenly asking questions about it becomes bigotry. That's not how facts work, Congresswoman. The moderator made another desperate attempt to regain control. Mr. Shapiro, we really must move to the structured portion of the debate. We have a format that both parties agreed to, and one final question on this topic. Shapiro stared directly at Omar. Will you commit right now to not paying your husband's companies any more campaign money? Simple yes or no. Will you stop the self-dealing? Omar looked at her lawyer. He was shaking his head frantically. Don't commit to anything. Leave your options open. Stick to the standard response. My campaign will make all decisions based on applicable campaign finance laws and regulations, Omar said carefully. That's not what I asked. Will you stop paying your husband? It's legal, but is it ethical? Yes or no? We will follow all regulations and you won't commit to stopping. Shapiro closed the first folder. Perfect. That tells us everything we need to know. He picked up the second folder. The label was clearly visible to every camera in the room. Anti-Semitism, a pattern. We have 87 minutes left, Congresswoman. Shapiro opened the folder. I have 4 more folders. Let's talk about your tweets regarding Jews and Israel. Let's discuss why your own party removed you from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Let's talk about it's all about the Benjamins, baby. This is going to be a very long night for you. The auditorium erupted. Half the crowd cheered, half booed. Everyone was riveted. And Ben Shapiro, the 39-year-old Orthodox Jew from Los Angeles who talked faster than anyone could effectively rebut, was just getting started. Shapiro opened the second folder with deliberate slowness, giving the cameras time to focus on the label. Anti-Semitism, a pattern. He pulled out a printed timeline and set it on his podium where he could reference it easily. Congresswoman Omar, let's talk about your statements regarding Jews, Israel, and AIPAC. And I'm going to do something that might seem revolutionary in modern political discourse. I'm going to quote your exact words, not interpretations, not paraphrases, not out-of-context snippets, your actual statements in full with dates and sources. Are you ready? Omar shifted uncomfortably. I've always been willing to discuss my record. Excellent, Shapiro gestured to the screens. A tweet appeared, blown up large enough for everyone to read clearly. February 2012. You tweeted, and I'm reading verbatim, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. That's a direct quote from your Twitter account. The tweet was deleted years later, but it's archived. Do you remember writing that? That was over a decade ago, and I've repeatedly apologized and we'll get to your apologies. First, let's discuss what you meant. Shapiro's tone remained clinical. Hypnotize the world. Congresswoman, that's a classic anti-Semitic trope. The idea that Jews possess some supernatural power to control minds, to manipulate global perception, to puppet governments from the shadows. It appears in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated document used to justify pogroms. It appears in Nazi propaganda depicting Jews as puppet masters controlling world leaders. It appears in modern anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish global control. And it appeared in your tweet. What did you mean by hypnotized? I was criticizing Israeli government policy regarding the treatment of Palestinians by suggesting they had supernatural mind control powers. Shapiro let that hang. That's your defense. Let me ask you this. Have you ever accused any other country of hypnotizing the world? Have you said Saudi Arabia hypnotized the world, China, Russia, Iran, Syria, North Korea? I was speaking metaphorically about. Metaphorically using an anti-Semitic trope. Let's continue the timeline. Shapiro advanced the slide. February 2019. Journalist Glenn Greenwald tweets about congressional support for Israel. You respond, and I quote, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." Then, when asked who you think is paying American politicians to support Israel, you reply with one word, AIPAC. Do you remember these tweets? I do, and I've apologized for the language I used. What were you apologizing for? Be specific. What exactly was wrong with those tweets? Omar paused, choosing words carefully. The language I used was not precise, and I understand that it invoked certain anti-Semitic tropes about. You were suggesting that American support for Israel is bought with Jewish money. Shapiro interrupted. That's what you were saying. You weren't being imprecise. You were being explicitly anti-Semitic. Let me read what the Anti-Defamation League said about your tweets. He pulled out a printed statement. Quote, Representative Omar's tweets perpetuate an ugly conspiracy theory about Jewish influence over government through money. This is unacceptable coming from any elected official. End quote. Not my words. The ADL's words. An organization dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism said you were perpetuating anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The next slide appeared. Omar's apology tweet. Here's what you tweeted in response. I am grateful for Jewish allies and colleagues who are educating me on the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes. Educating you. Shapiro's voice dripped with sarcasm. As if you, a sitting member of Congress, a college graduate, an adult human being living in the 21st century, somehow didn't know that accusing Jews of buying government influence was offensive. He leaned forward. Congresswoman, I'm going to let you in on a secret. Everyone knows that accusing Jews of secret financial control is anti-Semitic. Everyone. It's not obscure historical knowledge. It's not some hidden piece of information that requires special education. You're an intelligent woman. You knew exactly what you were saying. The question is whether you said it because you believe it or because you calculated it would play well with certain segments of your political base. I was criticizing lobbying influence in general, not. Then let's test that claim. Name 3 other lobbying organizations you've criticized with the same intensity as AIPAC. 3. I'll wait. Omar started to respond. The NRA has far too much influence over gun policy. Fossil fuel companies have corrupted climate. Did you tweet, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby, about the NRA"? Shapiro interrupted. Did you suggest fossil fuel companies were buying allegiance to a foreign country? I didn't say AIPAC was buying allegiance to a foreign country. Oh, but you did. Shapiro advanced the slide again. March 2019. At a bookstore event called Busboys and Poets in Washington, D.C., you said, and this is transcribed directly from video, "I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country." You were discussing Israel and AIPAC. You were accusing American Jews of dual loyalty. Loyalty to Israel over America. That's another classic anti-Semitic trope. He pulled out a history book and opened to a marked page. The charge of dual loyalty has been used to exclude Jews from government positions for centuries. In medieval Europe, Jews were accused of being more loyal to their fellow Jews than to their Christian rulers. In the Soviet Union, Jews were accused of being Zionist spies. In America, even after Jews had served in Congress, fought in wars, and contributed to society for generations, they still faced accusations of divided loyalty. And now you, in 2019, are resurrecting that same ancient hatred. Shapiro's voice intensified. Let me explain something to you as an Orthodox Jew, as someone whose grandparents fled persecution in Europe. When you tweet that Israel has hypnotized the world, you're not criticizing policy. When you say support for Israel is bought with Benjamins, you're not critiquing lobbying. When you question allegiance to a foreign country, you're not debating foreign policy. You're trafficking in ancient hatreds. You're using language that has been weaponized against my people for generations. And you know it. Omar tried to respond. I have Jewish friends. I have Jewish staff members. I work with Jewish colleagues every day and they know that I have Jewish friends defense. Shapiro cut her off. Really? That's where we're going. Let me share what some of your Jewish colleagues in Congress said about your statements. He pulled out multiple printed statements. Representative Elliot Engel, Democrat from New York, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the time, said your comments were a vile anti-Semitic slur. Representative Ted Deutsch, Democrat from Florida, said you were repeating anti-Semitic tropes. Representative Max Rose, Democrat from New York, a Jewish combat veteran who served in Afghanistan, said your statements were deeply hurtful to Jews, including myself. Shapiro looked up from the papers. These aren't Republicans attacking you. These aren't conservative commentators. These are Democrats, Jewish Democrats, your own colleagues, members of your own party who recognized what your statements were. The screen showed the next slide. A House resolution from March 2019. In response to your statements, the House of Representatives passed House Resolution 183, a resolution specifically condemning anti-Semitism. Your own party leadership felt compelled to publicly rebuke you. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who reflexively defends Democrats from Republican attacks, issued a statement saying, and I quote, Congresswoman Omar's use of anti-Semitic tropes and prejudicial accusations about Israel's supporters is deeply offensive. We condemn these remarks. Nancy Pelosi condemned you, the leader of your own party. Shapiro's voice was building now, faster and more intense. And then what happened? Did you learn? Did you stop? No. In June 2021, you tweeted comparing the United States and Israel to the Taliban and Hamas. You put American and Israeli democracies with legal systems, civil rights protections, independent judiciaries, and constitutional guarantees in the same moral category as terrorist organizations that deliberately target civilians. He pulled out another document. Representative Brad Schneider, Democrat from Illinois, along with 11 other House Democrats, issued a joint statement saying, and I quote, "Drawing false equivalencies between democracies like the U.S. and Israel and groups that engage in terrorism like Hamas and the Taliban foments prejudice and undermines progress toward peace." 12 Democrats, your own party, condemning you. Again, the overhead screen showed a new slide. February 2023, removed from Foreign Affairs Committee. And finally, in February 2023, the House voted to remove you from the Foreign Affairs Committee. The vote was 218 to 211. Even some Democrats voted to remove you. You were stripped of your committee assignment because your statements about Israel and Jews had become so toxic, so indefensible, that your own party couldn't protect you anymore. Shapiro closed the folder slowly. So let me summarize the facts. You've made anti-Semitic statements at least 3 separate times. You've been condemned by your own party leadership multiple times. You've been rebuked by Jewish Democratic colleagues. The House passed resolutions condemning anti-Semitism specifically because of you. You were removed from a committee because of your statements. You've apologized 3 times and kept doing it anyway. He stared directly at Omar. Now here's my question. At what point do we stop calling these mistakes and start recognizing them as your actual beliefs? You don't accidentally stumble into anti-Semitic tropes 3 separate times, get educated 3 separate times, apologize 3 separate times, and then keep doing it unless the anti-Semitism reflects something you genuinely believe, unless you've calculated that it's politically useful for you. The crowd was murmuring. Some Omar supporters were shaking their heads in disagreement, but others looked troubled, uncertain. Omar tried to respond. I think there's a real difference between criticizing Israeli government policy, which should be allowed in a democracy, and I agree, Shapiro interrupted. There absolutely is a difference, and you've crossed that line repeatedly. Let me demonstrate. Here are legitimate criticisms of Israeli policy. I believe Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank undermines peace prospects. I disagree with Israel's military tactics in Gaza. I think Israel should negotiate with Palestinians in good faith. Those are policy criticisms. Here are anti-Semitic statements. Israel has hypnotized the world. It's all about the Benjamins. Allegiance to a foreign country. See the difference? He didn't wait for an answer. You're not criticizing policy when you use those phrases. You're suggesting Jews have sinister power, that they buy influence, that they're disloyal. That's not foreign policy debate. That's bigotry dressed up in political language. I represent a diverse district with many different viewpoints on these issues. Your district has a significant Jewish population, about 15,000 Jews in Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. How do you think they feel when their congresswoman tweets that support for Israel is bought with Benjamins? When you suggest American Jews have allegiance to a foreign country, you're not representing them. You're insulting them. You're making them feel unsafe in their own country. Shapiro pulled out one more document. Let me read something from the American Jewish Committee's 2023 State of Anti-Semitism in America report. It found that 78% of American Jews felt less safe after the October 7th Hamas attacks. The same report noted that political rhetoric, including from elected officials, contributes significantly to this sense of insecurity. He looked up. Your rhetoric, Congresswoman, your statements about Jews and Israel make Jewish Americans feel less safe. Do you care about that? Do you care that your words have real-world consequences for real people? Omar started to answer, but Shapiro cut her off again. Actually, don't answer, because here's what I think. I think you've calculated that anti-Israel rhetoric plays well with certain parts of your progressive base. I think you've decided that the far left will defend you no matter what you say about Jews or Israel. I think you've concluded that you can traffic in anti-Semitic tropes, apologize when the backlash gets too intense, and then do it again a few months later because it's politically useful for you. His voice softened slightly, becoming almost sad. And what's tragic is that there are legitimate criticisms of Israeli government policy. There are important debates to have about settlements, about Palestinian rights, about the peace process. But you've poisoned that debate. You've made it impossible to have productive conversations because you keep injecting ancient anti-Semitic hatred into modern policy discussions. You had a platform. You could have elevated the discourse. Instead, you debased it. And Jewish Americans are less safe because of you. The auditorium was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the sound of journalists typing frantically. Shapiro picked up his third folder. Now let's talk about September 11th, 2001. Let's talk about how you described the worst terrorist attack on American soil. Let's talk about what you called it and why your choice of words reveals everything we need to know about how you view terrorism against Americans. Omar's face had gone pale. She looked at her lawyer who was making cutting motions with his hands. End this. Walk off. Shut it down. But the cameras were rolling. Thousands of people were watching, both in the auditorium and streaming online. She couldn't walk away now, and Ben Shapiro was just getting started. Shapiro advanced to the next slide without pausing. Video footage appeared on the overhead screens. Ilhan Omar speaking at a podium with a CAIR banner behind her. March 23, 2019. Council on American Islamic Relations event in Los Angeles. You gave a speech about civil liberties and Muslim Americans. Let me play the relevant clip. The video played. Omar's voice filled the auditorium. CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Shapiro paused the video. The phrase hung in the air like poison gas. Some people did something. His voice was quiet now, which somehow made it more devastating. That's how you described September 11th, the terrorist attack that killed 2,977 Americans. The attack where 19 Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. The attack where people jumped from burning buildings to their deaths rather than burn alive. The attack where first responders ran into collapsing towers knowing they might not come out. The attack where firefighters climbed stairs while everyone else ran down. The attack that traumatized an entire generation of Americans. He let the silence hang for 5 full seconds. And you called it some people did something, as if we don't know who, as if the identity of the attackers is somehow mysterious or unclear, did something, as if we don't know what they did, as if flying planes into buildings and murdering 3,000 people is just something. Shapiro's voice remained clinical, but his words cut deeper than any emotional outburst could have. Congresswoman, I'm going to ask you to do something you've never done. I'm going to ask you to describe what happened on September 11, 2001, using clear, accurate, respectful language. Can you do that? Can you say Islamic terrorists murdered 2,977 Americans in a coordinated attack on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and United Flight 93? Can you say those words right now, in front of these cameras? Omar's hands gripped the podium. Her media training had prepared her for attacks, but not for this. Not for being asked to simply state basic facts about 9/11. The quote you're using was taken out of context. I was explaining why CAIR was founded, why Muslim Americans faced backlash after the attacks, why civil rights protections were necessary. I literally just played the full clip. What context makes "some people did something" acceptable? What context makes that phrase appropriate when discussing the mass murder of 3,000 Americans? I was explaining the historical circumstances that led to CAIR's founding, the discrimination that Muslim Americans faced. And in explaining that, you minimized the worst attack on American soil as "some people did something." But let me ask you this. Have you ever referred to the Holocaust as "some people did something"? Have you ever called the Rwandan genocide "some people did something"? Have you described the Armenian genocide that way? Slavery, lynchings, the Tulsa massacre, silence. Have you ever described any other atrocity with such casual, dismissive language? I wasn't trying to minimize the tragedy of 9/11, but you did minimize it. Whether you intended to or not, you reduced 9/11 to the blandest, most passive language possible. Some people, as if we don't know who. As if the identity of the attackers is mysterious. Did something. As if we don't know what they did. As if flying planes into buildings is just something that happened, like a car accident or a rainstorm. Shapiro's voice remained level, but his words were devastating. Let me give you some context of my own. 8 months before you gave that speech, I attended the funeral of a family friend, someone I'd known for 20 years. He died in the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. His name was James Cartier. He was 34 years old. He worked for Cantor Fitzgerald on the 104th floor of the North Tower. He had a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. His wife was pregnant with their second child. The auditorium was completely silent now. When Flight 11 hit the North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors, everyone above the impact zone was trapped. The stairwells were destroyed. The elevators were gone. The building was filling with smoke and fire. James called his wife from his desk. He told her he loved her. He told her to tell their daughter he loved her. He told her to name the baby after him if it was a boy. And then the tower collapsed and he was gone. Burned to death or crushed or suffocated. We don't know which because they never found enough of his body to determine cause of death. Shapiro pulled out a photograph. A young man in a business suit smiling at the camera. This is James. He wasn't some person. He was a specific person with a name and a family and a life. And what happened to him wasn't something. It was murder. Islamic terrorists murdered him deliberately, intentionally, as part of a coordinated attack on America. And when you use passive, dismissive language to describe his death, you're not just being politically tone-deaf. You're being morally obscene. Omar tried to interrupt. I have expressed sympathy for the victims of 9/11 on multiple occasions. After the backlash, after the New York Post ran your quote on the front page next to images of the burning towers, after even Democrats criticized you, then you expressed sympathy. But your instinctive language, the words you chose when you weren't being careful, was, "Some people did something." That tells us what you actually think when you're not managing your public image. Shapiro pulled out another document. But it's not just 9/11. Let's look at your broader pattern of statements about terrorism. June 2021, you tweeted, "We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity. We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the US, Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban." He looked up from the paper. You compared the United States and Israel to Hamas and the Taliban. Let me be very clear about what those organizations are. Hamas, a designated terrorist organization that deliberately fires rockets at Israeli civilians, uses children as human shields, pays stipends to families of suicide bombers, and explicitly calls for the destruction of Israel in its charter. The Taliban harbored al-Qaeda before 9/11, killed American soldiers for 20 years, oppresses women, destroys schools, executes people for violating Sharia law, and took over Afghanistan after we withdrew. The screens showed images of Taliban public executions and Hamas rocket attacks. And you put them in the same moral category as America and Israel. Two democracies with constitutions, legal systems, civil rights protections, independent courts, free press, and rules of engagement in warfare. This isn't moral equivalence. This is moral insanity. Representative Brad Schneider's response appeared on the screen. Your Democratic colleague, Representative Schneider, issued a statement signed by 12 Democrats saying, "Drawing false equivalencies between democracies like the US and Israel and groups that engage in terrorism like Hamas and the Taliban foments prejudice and undermines progress toward peace." 12 Democrats felt compelled to rebuke you publicly. Omar tried to defend herself. "I was calling for accountability through international legal mechanisms. I believe that all parties to conflicts should be subject to the same standards of international humanitarian law." No, you were creating a false moral equivalence. Let me ask you directly. Do you believe the United States and Israel are morally equivalent to Hamas and the Taliban? Yes or no? Of course not. Then why did you tweet it? Why did you put them in the same sentence, suggesting they commit the same level of atrocities? Either you believe the comparison is valid, or you were being recklessly inflammatory to score political points with your base. Which is it? I was highlighting that international law should apply equally to all parties. To democracies that already follow international law and terrorist organizations that explicitly reject it. That's your argument. Shapiro shook his head. Let me explain something about international law and rules of warfare. Israel warns civilians before airstrikes. Hamas hides weapons in schools and hospitals. America investigates civilian casualties and prosecutes soldiers who violate rules of engagement. The Taliban executes people without trial. These are not equivalent behaviors. These are not equivalent moral positions. Shapiro advanced to another slide showing Omar's voting record. But here's what I find most revealing about your pattern of statements. You minimize 9/11. You compare America to the Taliban. You equate Israel with Hamas. But you know what you don't do? You don't show the same scrutiny toward actual terrorist organizations or regimes that commit massive human rights abuses. A timeline appeared. September 2019. The House voted on a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide, the systematic murder of 1.5 million Armenian Christians by the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923. You voted present. Not yes, not no. Present. Why? Because Turkey, a country that denies the genocide to this day, didn't want the resolution to pass, and you didn't want to offend Turkey. Hold up another vote. January 2020. The House voted to limit President Trump's military action against Iran. That's fine. You can oppose military action. But in your floor speech, you said we need to de-escalate tensions with Iran. Iran, a country that sponsors Hezbollah and Hamas, a country that funds terrorism across the Middle East, a country that chants death to America in its parliament, a country that oppresses women, executes gay people, and imprisons journalists. You want to de-escalate with them. But Israel, America's democratic ally, you want to sanction and condemn. Another slide appeared. October 2023. After Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel that killed 1,200 people, including 36 Americans, you waited 4 days to condemn it. 4 days. And when you finally did issue a statement, it included this line. We must also address the occupation and violence that Palestinians have endured for decades. You couldn't condemn a terrorist massacre of civilians without immediately pivoting to, but Israel. Shapiro's rapid-fire delivery was overwhelming. Facts, votes, quotes, all cascading one after another. Here's the pattern, Congresswoman. You minimize terrorism when it targets Americans or Israelis. You create false equivalences between democracies and terrorist organizations. You show more sympathy for regimes that oppress their citizens than for America and its allies. And when anyone points this out, you claim you're being attacked for being Muslim. He leaned forward. But that's not what's happening. You're not being criticized for being Muslim. You're being criticized for your actual statements and your actual voting record. There are multiple Muslim members of Congress. Representatives Andre Carson and Rashida Tlaib, for example. But Carson doesn't minimize 9/11. He doesn't compare America to the Taliban. He doesn't face this criticism because he doesn't make these statements. This isn't about your identity. This is about your judgment and your values. Omar's voice rose for the first time. I came to this country as a refugee fleeing violence. I understand terrorism and its impact better than most people in this room. Better than what? Shapiro shot back. Better than the families who lost loved ones on 9/11. Better than the soldiers who fought the Taliban. Better than the Israeli civilians murdered by Hamas. Better than the Afghan women trapped under Taliban rule. Don't you dare suggest that your refugee experience gives you special insight that excuses minimizing terrorism or creating false moral equivalences. Shapiro pulled out a photograph and held it up. A young man in a business suit smiling. This is James Cartier, age 34. Worked for Cantor Fitzgerald on the 104th floor of the North Tower. Husband, father of one with another on the way. Loved baseball, coached Little League. Made his wife laugh every single day. Died on September 11, 2001 when Islamic terrorists, not some people, flew a plane into his building. He didn't have something happen to him. He was murdered, deliberately, intentionally, by people who wanted him dead because he was American. He set the photo on his podium where it stayed, facing the cameras. Say his name. Acknowledge what happened to him. Describe 9/11 using accurate language that respects the dead and their families. The crowd was completely silent. Some people were crying. Omar's hands were shaking on the podium. You owe the 9/11 families an apology, a real one, not a defensive statement issued by your staff after backlash. A genuine acknowledgement that your language was offensive, hurtful, and wrong. Can you do that right now? Can you apologize for saying some people did something? Omar's composure finally cracked. Her voice shook. I never intended to cause pain to the families of 9/11 victims. If my words hurt them, I deeply regret that. That's not an apology. That's I'm sorry you were offended. Try again. Apologize for your actual words. Take responsibility for what you said. Long pause. Omar swallowed hard. I apologize for the language I used when discussing 9/11. It was inappropriate and hurtful, and I should have chosen my words more carefully. Thank you. Shapiro's tone suggested genuine appreciation. That took 4 years and a public debate, but thank you. Now let's talk about something you've never addressed publicly. Let's talk about your marriages. Let's talk about Ahmed Nursaid Elmi. Let's talk about the allegations that you married your biological brother to commit immigration fraud. And let's talk about why you've refused to take a DNA test that would definitively prove the allegations false. The crowd erupted. This was the allegation everyone had heard whispers about, but that mainstream media rarely covered directly. Omar's lawyer stood up, gesturing frantically, but Shapiro was already opening the fourth folder. Congresswoman Omar, Shapiro began, his voice measured but relentless. There's been one allegation following you since 2016 that you've never directly addressed with evidence. Conservative media has investigated it. Your opponents have raised it. Even some mainstream outlets have asked questions, but you've never provided definitive proof one way or the other. Tonight, we're going to discuss it in detail. The overhead screen displayed a timeline of marriages and immigration records. Let me present the publicly available facts, not speculation, not conspiracy theories. Documented public records from Minnesota courts, federal immigration databases, and your own social media accounts. Are you ready? Omar sat rigidly at her podium, saying nothing. 2002. You enter into what you describe as a faith-based marriage with Ahmed Hiasi. This marriage is not legally recognized under U.S. law, but according to your own statements, you live together and have children together. 2008. You and Hiasi separate. You've stated publicly that the relationship ended and you went your separate ways. 2009. 1 year after separating from Hiasi, you legally marry a man named Ahmed Nursaid Elmi. This is your first legal marriage under U.S. law. You are 26 years old. Ahmed Nursaid Elmi is approximately 23 years old. 2011. Ahmed Nursaid Elmi obtains U.S. permanent residency. He achieves this immigration status based on his marriage to you, a U.S. citizen. Marriage to a U.S. citizen is one of the fastest paths to permanent residency and eventually citizenship. 2011 to 2017. During this 6-year period, you remain legally married to Elmi. However, public records, property records, and social media posts show you living with Ahmed Hiasi. You attend events together. You post family photos together. You refer to him as your partner. You have more children together, all while you are legally married to a completely different person. 2017. You file for divorce from Ahmed Nursaid Elmi after 8 years of marriage. The divorce is finalized quickly with no contest. 2018. You legally marry Ahmed Hiasi, the man you were with before, the man you were with during your marriage to Elmi, and the man you're with now. Shapiro looked up from the timeline. That's the documented sequence of events from public records. Now let me ask you some questions that this timeline raises. First question. Why did you legally marry Ahmed Nursaid Elmi in 2009 if you were planning to reunite with Ahmed Hiasi? Omar started to answer, but Shapiro continued. Let me make this more specific. You married Elmi 1 year after separating from Hiasi. But then, based on public records, you immediately started living with Hiasi again while remaining legally married to Elmi. Why? What was the purpose of the legal marriage to Elmi if you were going to continue your relationship with Hiasi? Ahmed Hiasi and I had a complicated relationship during that period. We were separated for several years before reconciling. But you weren't separated. Shapiro pulled out documents. Instagram posts from 2012 through 2016 show you and Hiasi together at family events, children's birthday parties and social gatherings. Property records show both of your names on residential leases. Your children lived with both of you. You were together while legally married to a different person. Why? Omar's lawyer stood up. These questions are invasive and have nothing to do with her service in Congress. They have everything to do with immigration fraud allegations. Shapiro shot back. If a Republican congressman married someone, that person got immigration benefits through the marriage, and then the congressman divorced them and married someone else. Would we be allowed to ask questions? Or would that be invasive too? He turned back to Omar. Second question. Why did Ahmed Nursaid Elmi need permanent residency through marriage to you? He could have applied for residency through other means. Employment-based visas, student visas, asylum. Why did he need to marry an American citizen to get residency? What was special about his situation? I'm not going to discuss his personal immigration situation. That's private. You don't need to discuss his situation. You need to discuss yours. You married him. Your marriage gave him immigration benefits. You submitted affidavits to immigration authorities. You provided evidence of a genuine marital relationship. What was the reason for the marriage? We were in a relationship at the time. Were you? Shapiro advanced the slide. Then why did you file joint tax returns with Ahmed Hiasi while legally married to Ahmed Nursaid Elmi? Tax return forms appeared on screen, with personal information redacted but key details visible. 2012 tax return, filed jointly with Ahmed Hiasi, but you were legally married to Elmi. 2013 tax return, filed jointly with Hiasi, still married to Elmi. 2014, 2015, 2016, all filed jointly with Hiasi while legally married to Elmi. That's 5 years of tax returns filed jointly with someone you weren't married to. Shapiro's voice sharpened. Do you know what that is, Congresswoman? That's tax fraud. You can't file joint tax returns with someone unless you're legally married to them. It's perjury on your tax forms. The IRS penalty for filing false joint returns is up to $250,000 and 3 years in prison per count. You committed this violation 5 times. That's 5 separate federal crimes. The crowd was buzzing now. This was documentation they'd never seen presented so clearly. There were complications with how my marital status was classified during that period, and we worked with accountants too. Complications you created by marrying someone while intending to be with someone else. Shapiro interrupted. Let me ask you directly. Did you marry Ahmed Nursaid Elmi to help him obtain U.S. immigration benefits while actually maintaining a relationship with Ahmed Hiasi? That's a conspiracy theory with no basis in fact. Then prove it. Let me explain something about DNA testing. Shapiro pulled out a scientific document. If someone is your biological sibling, you share approximately 50% of your DNA. You have the same parents. If someone is your cousin, you share about 12.5%. If someone is your aunt or uncle, you share about 25%. If someone is completely unrelated, you share minimal DNA. A simple DNA test can definitively determine biological relationships with 99.9% accuracy. He pulled out printed reports. Conservative media outlets and investigative journalists have published extensive research, genealogical records from Somalia, family trees, statements from people in Minnesota's Somali community, documents suggesting that Ahmed Nursaid Elmi may be your biological brother. They've presented evidence that you may share the same parents, that you may have grown up in the same household in Mogadishu. Those reports are false. They're based on rumors and deliberate misinformation spread by people who want to. Then take a DNA test, Shapiro interrupted. If Ahmed Nursaid Elmi is not your biological brother, a DNA test would definitively prove it. The test takes 5 minutes. Results are conclusive. One test would end this controversy forever and vindicate you completely. It would prove every accusation false. Why haven't you taken the test? I don't have to dignify baseless conspiracy theories with. It's not about dignity. It's about evidence. You're accused of a serious federal crime, immigration fraud. You're accused of marrying a family member to circumvent immigration law. A DNA test would prove your innocence definitively. Why won't you take it? Because it's Islamophobic persecution designed to. DNA testing isn't Islamophobic. Shapiro's voice was sharp. It's science. Courts use DNA tests every single day to establish paternity, to solve crimes, to identify remains, to prove family relationships in immigration cases. There is nothing religious or discriminatory about DNA testing. If a Christian politician or a Jewish politician or an atheist politician face the same allegations, we would demand they take a DNA test to prove innocence. Why should you be exempt? Shapiro's voice intensified. Let me tell you how innocent people behave. If someone accused me of being biologically related to someone I married, I would take a DNA test immediately. That day, that hour, I would volunteer for the test. I would demand the test. I would do everything possible to prove the allegation false because my reputation and my legal status would depend on it. But you've done the opposite. You've refused testing. You've called it conspiracy theories. You've claimed it's beneath your dignity. You've accused people of bigotry. You've done everything except provide evidence of your innocence. And that refusal, that consistent pattern of deflection instead of evidence, is the most damning thing we have. It suggests you can't take the test because you know what the results would show. The screens showed immigration forms. Let me show you what we know from public records. When Ahmed Nur said Elmi applied for permanent residency based on marriage to you, he had to submit extensive documentation. Marriage certificates, joint financial records, photos together, evidence of living together, proof of a genuine marital relationship. He had to convince immigration authorities that your marriage was real, not fraudulent. You provided that documentation. You signed affidavits swearing under oath that you were in a legitimate marriage with him. You submitted photos. You submitted evidence of joint residence. You convinced immigration authorities that your marriage was genuine. But if you were actually living with Ahmed Hiasi during this entire time, and public records show you were, then all that documentation was false. You fabricated evidence of a marital relationship that didn't exist. That's immigration fraud. That's perjury. That's conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Shapiro paused, letting it sink in. So here are the facts as we currently know them. You married Elmi and he got immigration benefits. You divorced Elmi after he obtained permanent residency. You then married Hiasi, the man you were actually with the entire time. You filed false tax returns for multiple years. You submitted potentially false affidavits to immigration authorities. You refused to take a DNA test that would prove the allegations false. Either provide evidence of your innocence, or we're left to conclude that the allegations are true. Omar's voice was desperate. This is an invasion of my family's privacy. My personal relationships are not. You're a public official accused of federal crimes. Your privacy doesn't override the public's right to know whether their congresswoman committed immigration fraud and tax fraud. Take the test. Prove us wrong. It's that simple. I will not be bullied into. You're not being bullied. You're being asked for evidence. Evidence that would take 5 minutes to provide and would completely vindicate you and end this controversy forever. Your refusal to provide that evidence speaks volumes. It suggests guilt. Shapiro closed the folder. Let me summarize what we've established tonight. Campaign finance violations. You paid your husband's company $2.8 million with no clear deliverable services. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board found you violated campaign finance law and ordered you to pay reimbursement. Anti-Semitic statements. Multiple instances documented with your exact words. Condemned by your own party leadership. Removed from the House Foreign Affairs Committee specifically because of those statements. 9/11 minimization. You described the worst terrorist attack on American soil as some people did something. Offensive and hurtful language that you only apologized for after intense public backlash. Terrorism comparisons. You equated America and Israel with Hamas and the Taliban, creating false moral equivalences that were condemned by 12 of your Democratic colleagues. Suspicious marriage timeline. You married someone who obtained immigration benefits through that marriage, then divorced him and married your actual long-term partner. The timeline raises serious questions about the legitimacy of the first marriage. Tax fraud, multiple years of filing joint tax returns with someone you weren't legally married to. That's multiple federal crimes. Immigration fraud allegations. You refuse to provide DNA evidence that would definitively prove your innocence. That refusal suggests you can't provide the evidence because you know what it would show. That's your record. That's who you are based on documented public facts. And we haven't even talked yet about what you've actually accomplished for your constituents or how Minneapolis has fared under your representation. The audience was stunned. Some Omar supporters had already left. Others looked shaken, uncertain. We have 30 minutes remaining. Shapiro picked up his fifth and final folder. Let's talk about what you've actually accomplished as a congresswoman. Let's talk about legislation you've passed. Let's talk about how Minneapolis has fared under your representation. Let's talk about defunding the police and the crime wave that followed. Let's talk about what you've done for Minnesota besides make it famous for all the wrong reasons. He opened the folder. It was noticeably thinner than the others. This one is labeled Accomplishments. It's surprisingly thin. In fact, it's almost empty. Let's discuss why. Shapiro opened the final folder with deliberate slowness. Inside were just 3 pages of printed text. Congresswoman Omar, you've been in Congress since January 2019. That's nearly 5 years. You represent Minnesota's 5th congressional district, which includes Minneapolis and some surrounding suburbs. Over 700,000 people. Let me ask you a simple question. What legislation have you passed? What bills have you authored that became law? Omar started to answer, but Shapiro continued. Let me make this easier. I'll tell you the answer. According to Congress.gov, the official legislative tracking website, you've been the primary sponsor of 22 bills during your time in Congress. Of those 22 bills, exactly 0 have become law. 0, not 1, in 5 years. The number appeared on the screen in massive font. 0. For comparison, let's look at your Minnesota colleagues. Representative Dean Phillips, also a Democrat, also first elected in 2018, has passed 6 bills into law. Representative Angie Craig, another Minnesota Democrat from the same class, has passed 4 bills. Representative Pete Stauber, a Republican from Minnesota elected the same year, has passed 3 bills. Even representatives in the minority party typically pass at least 1 or 2 bills through committee work and bipartisan compromise. But you, nothing. 0. You've accomplished legislatively exactly what someone who stayed home and never ran for Congress would have accomplished. Omar tried to interject. Legislative success isn't measured solely by bills passed. There are other ways to serve constituents and advance important causes. Of course, let's talk about those other accomplishments. Shapiro nodded as if conceding a reasonable point. You're a member of the House Budget Committee. What budgetary reforms have you championed that were actually adopted? What amendments have you successfully added to spending bills? What specific provisions in any budget can you point to and say, I did that? Silence. You were on the House Foreign Affairs Committee until you were removed. During your time on that committee, what diplomatic initiatives did you successfully advance? What hearings did you lead that resulted in policy changes? What agreements did you help facilitate? More silence. Let me ask this differently. Tell me one concrete, tangible thing you've accomplished for Minnesota's 5th district. One specific achievement that made your constituents' lives measurably better. Infrastructure projects funded. Economic development initiatives. Grants secured for local schools or hospitals or community centers. Give me just one. Omar started listing talking points. I've fought tirelessly for raising the minimum wage, for student debt relief, for Medicare for all, for affordable housing, for climate justice. Fighting for isn't accomplishing, Shapiro interrupted. Has the minimum wage been raised federally? No. Has student debt been broadly relieved? No. Has Medicare for all passed? No. Has affordable housing become more available? Minneapolis housing prices have actually increased significantly during your tenure. You fought for things that didn't happen. That's not accomplishment. That's just having opinions and giving speeches. Shapiro advanced to the next slide. But let's talk about what has happened in your district. Let's specifically talk about what happened in Minneapolis after you supported defunding the police. A graph appeared showing Minneapolis crime statistics over time. May 2020. George Floyd is murdered by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin in your district. Protests begin, riots follow, buildings burn, and you tweet your support for dismantling the Minneapolis Police Department. You call MPD rotten to the root. You advocate for defunding police and reimagining public safety with community-based alternatives. More graphs appeared. Here's what happened to Minneapolis after the defunding movement that you championed. 2019 to 2021, murders increased 83%. Violent crime increased 42%. 2020 to 2023, over 200 police officers left MPD. That's a staffing crisis. Average police response time increased from 11 minutes to 17 minutes. Business impact. 36% of businesses in the 3rd Precinct area never reopened after the riots. Downtown Minneapolis office vacancy rate increased from 8% to 23%. Retail businesses reported 64% decrease in foot traffic. Those are FBI crime statistics and local economic data. Minneapolis became demonstrably less safe and economically weaker after implementing the policies you supported. How do you explain that? Omar tried to pivot. The increase in crime is due to systemic issues, poverty, lack of economic opportunity, historical disinvestment in communities of color. You can't just look at. Poverty and lack of opportunity didn't suddenly appear in 2020. Shapiro cut her off. Minneapolis has had economic inequality for decades. It's had racial disparities for decades. What changed specifically in 2020 and 2021? You and your allies called for defunding the police. Officers left the force in massive numbers. Response times increased, and crime skyrocketed. Cause and effect. Shapiro pulled out polling data. Here's what your constituents think. In November 2021, Minneapolis held a ballot measure to replace MPD with a Department of Public Safety, exactly what you advocated for. The measure was rejected by 56% of voters. In your own city, in your own district, your own constituents rejected your signature policy position. Black voters in North Minneapolis, who are most affected by crime, overwhelmingly voted against your proposal. The ballot measure was complicated by misleading. Your constituents, including many people of color who you claim to represent, rejected your approach. They wanted police reform, yes, but not police defunding. They wanted accountability, but not abolition. Yet you were more interested in playing to a national progressive audience than listening to the actual people you represent. The screen showed a photo of a boarded-up storefront. This is Ahmed's Grocery on East Lake Street in your district, owned by a Somali-American immigrant for 23 years, destroyed in the 2020 riots. The owner, Ahmed Hassan, spent his life savings trying to rebuild, but insurance didn't fully cover riot damage. Crime in the area stayed high. Customers stopped coming. He eventually sold the property at a loss and moved his family out of Minneapolis entirely. That's your constituent. That's someone from your own Somali-American community. What did you do for him? What did you do for the hundreds of other small business owners who lost everything? Omar had no answer. Let me contrast your record with someone who has similar progressive politics but actually accomplishes things. Representative Ro Khanna from California, also progressive, also squad adjacent, represents Silicon Valley. Let's look at what he's done. A list appeared on screen. Passed the Bipartisan Credit for Caring Act to provide tax credits for family caregivers. Successfully advocated for removing the cap on quarterly disaster unemployment benefits. Led negotiations on workforce development provisions in the infrastructure bill. Worked with Republicans on right-to-repair legislation. Co-sponsored successful bills on expanding rural broadband access. He hasn't passed everything he wants. He hasn't achieved democratic socialism, but he works, he negotiates, he compromises, he delivers tangible results for his constituents. Why can't you do that? My approach is to fight for transformative change, not incremental. Transformative change that never transforms anything because it never passes, Shapiro interrupted. Let me explain something about Congress. It's a legislative body. The job is to legislate. That means compromising, building coalitions, negotiating with people you disagree with, passing laws that make incremental improvements to people's lives. That's the job you were elected to do. But you don't do the job, you give speeches. You send tweets. You appear on cable news, you generate controversies, and you pass nothing. You accomplish nothing. Shapiro pulled out more documents. Your social media engagement is impressive, I'll grant you that. You average 11.7 tweets per day. Your tweets get an average of 5,200 retweets each. You have 3.2 million Twitter followers. You're excellent at generating online engagement and controversy. But governance isn't about Twitter metrics. It's about improving people's actual lives. And by that measure, you failed completely. He looked directly at Omar. Here's what I think happened. You came to Congress as part of the 2018 progressive wave. You were one of the squad. Young, diverse, outspoken. You got attention for criticizing Trump, for pushing progressive policies, for being controversial. And you discovered that controversy is profitable. Controversy gets you on cable news. Controversy gets you national fundraising. Controversy makes you famous, so you leaned into it. Anti-Semitic tweets, controversy. Comparing America to the Taliban, controversy. Minimizing 9/11, controversy. Each one generated news cycles, fundraising emails, cable news appearances, social media attention. You became one of the most famous members of Congress not because you accomplished anything, but because you said outrageous things that generated reactions. Meanwhile, your district suffered. Crime increased. Businesses closed. Police protection deteriorated. But you were too busy being a national progressive celebrity to do the boring work of actually representing your constituents. The screen showed fundraising totals. Since entering Congress, you've raised over $11 million. That's impressive for a safe Democratic district where you face no real general election threat. But where does that money come from? Look at the donor map. Over 80% comes from outside Minnesota. Small donors from California, New York, Massachusetts, sending you money because you're controversial, because you attack Israel, because you say things that upset conservatives. You're not funded by your constituents. You're funded by national progressives who donate to you because you're famous for being controversial. You figured out the formula, say something outrageous. Get condemned by Republicans. Fundraise off the controversy. Repeat. It's brilliant marketing, but it's terrible governance. Omar's voice rose in frustration. I represent a diverse district with strong progressive values. My constituents elected me to fight for bold change, not to compromise those values for the sake of. Then, why did your constituents nearly vote you out in the 2022 primary? Shapiro interrupted. Don Samuels, a black former city councilman with no national profile and vastly less money than you, came within 2,500 votes of beating you. In a Democratic primary, in a safe Democratic district. You barely survived because your constituents are exhausted by your controversies and want actual representation instead of celebrity activism. Shapiro glanced at his notes. We're running out of time, so let me ask the fundamental question. Why should the people of Minnesota's 5th District re-elect you? What's your argument? What have you done for them? He held up his hand, counting on his fingers. You've passed no legislation. You've made Minneapolis less safe. You've embarrassed your district with anti-Semitic statements. You've minimized 9/11. You've paid your husband millions in campaign money while he faces fraud lawsuits. You've refused to address credible immigration fraud allegations with DNA evidence. You've been removed from committee assignments. You've focused on national controversies instead of local needs. You've rejected the policies your own constituents voted for. So tell me and tell them, why should they re-elect you? And you can't mention your identity. You can't claim you're being attacked. You can't deflect to what you're fighting for. Just tell us what you've actually done that merits another term. The auditorium was completely silent. Every camera was focused on Omar's face. This was the moment the entire debate had built toward. Omar opened her mouth to respond. And one more rule, Shapiro added. No talking points, no consultant-written BS. Just you honestly explaining what you've accomplished for your constituents. I'll wait. 5 seconds of silence. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Omar finally spoke, her voice uncertain. I have given voice to communities that have historically been excluded from power. I have brought attention to issues that Washington traditionally ignores. That's not an accomplishment, that's a marketing slogan. What have you done? What's better in Minneapolis because you're in Congress? What specific problem have you solved? More silence. You can't answer because there is no answer. You've accomplished nothing except making yourself famous for being controversial. And that's not representation. That's self-promotion. Shapiro closed his final folder. We're out of time, but I think we've established everything we needed to establish tonight. The moderator, who'd been largely sidelined for the past 90 minutes, tried to regain control. We'll now move to closing statements. Congresswoman Omar, you'll go first. You have 5 minutes. Omar used her closing statement to talk about fighting for marginalized communities, standing up to hate, refusing to be silenced by right-wing attacks, and the importance of diverse voices in Congress. She never addressed a single specific question Shapiro had raised. She never defended her record with facts. She retreated entirely to identity politics and progressive platitudes. When she finished, there was scattered applause from her supporters, but even they seemed subdued. Shapiro's closing was brief and devastating. Tonight I asked Congresswoman Omar about public records, FEC filings, House resolutions, voting records, tax returns, crime statistics, marriage records. I asked about her own words, tweets she wrote, statements she made, speeches she gave. I asked for evidence, DNA tests, legislative accomplishments, bills passed. These were factual questions with factual answers, and she couldn't answer them. She deflected to identity. She accused me of attacks. She pivoted to talking points, but she never defended her record because her record is indefensible. She paid her husband millions in donor money. She violated campaign finance laws. She made anti-Semitic statements repeatedly. She minimized 9/11. She compared America to the Taliban. She refuses to provide evidence disproving immigration fraud allegations. She's passed zero legislation. She made Minneapolis less safe. She represents out-of-state donors better than Minnesota constituents. Those are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings. They also don't care about your identity. Facts don't care if you're black, white, Muslim, Jewish, male, female, or anything else. Facts are facts. The question for voters in Minnesota's 5th District is simple. Do you want a representative who accomplishes things, or one who generates controversies? Do you want someone who works for you, or someone who works for their national brand? The choice is yours, but at least now you have the facts to make an informed decision. Thank you. Within 2 hours, Shapiro Destroys Omar was trending on Twitter with over 800,000 tweets. Clips from the debate had been viewed 15 million times. Conservative media declared it the greatest political debate performance in modern history. Progressive media called it an ambush and an Islamophobic attack. Mainstream media couldn't decide what to say. Omar's team issued a statement within 3 hours. Tonight was a reminder that hate and bigotry still exist in America. Ben Shapiro's attacks were rooted in Islamophobia, misogyny, and racism. His tactics were designed to bully and intimidate. We will not be silenced. We will continue fighting for justice. Shapiro responded on his podcast the next morning. I asked her about federal campaign finance reports, her own tweets, and public crime statistics. If that's Islamophobia, then your defense is even weaker than I thought. Facts aren't bigotry. Accountability isn't persecution. And asking public officials to defend their records isn't an attack. It's democracy. Within a week, polling showed Omar's approval rating in her district had dropped 9 points. Don Samuels announced he would challenge her again in the 2024 Democratic primary. 5 other candidates joined the race. Local Minneapolis newspapers began running editorials calling for accountability. Within a month, major Democratic Party donors began redirecting money away from Omar's campaign toward other progressive candidates who could actually pass legislation. Within 3 months, establishment Democrats quietly stopped defending her in public. And in August 2024, Don Samuels defeated Ilhan Omar in the Democratic primary by 7 percentage points. In his victory speech, Samuels said, "Tonight, the voters of Minneapolis chose accountability over controversy. They chose representation over celebrity. They chose substance over slogans. They chose someone who will work for them instead of someone who works for their national brand. This is a victory for everyone who believes elected officials should answer questions, defend their records, and actually serve their constituents." Ben Shapiro tweeted simply, "Facts don't care about your feelings." And tonight, facts won in Minnesota. The debate, those 90 minutes of relentless questioning, documented evidence, and refusal to accept deflection, had done what years of Republican attacks couldn't do. It had forced Ilhan Omar to defend her actual record without the shield of identity politics or the protection of sympathetic media. And when forced to defend her actual record with actual facts, she had nothing to say, because the facts spoke for themselves. And in the end, facts always win.